Hi everyone. Welcome back to the channel. This is your girl Smarty here to uncover stories of strength, betrayal, and the rise of the Black Queen. If you're ready for another story that will shake your soul and ignite your power, don't forget to like and subscribe. Welcome to Black Queen Dominion. The cold winter air bit at her cheeks, but nothing could compare to the chill that ran through her heart that fateful Christmas Eve. The streets glistened with festive lights, wreaths adorned every doorway, and the scent of cinnamon and pine wrapped the city in warmth. Yet inside the grand cathedral she felt the stark emptiness of humiliation. She walked down the aisle in her modest, elegant dress, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. Each step was deliberate, a careful attempt to hold herself together as the world watched. Her husband, the man she had trusted with her heart, her past and her future, was not beside her. Instead there he was, smiling, whispering, and holding the hand of another woman. The Mistress. A golden-haired, flawless creature whose presence was an insult layered in public spectacle. The congregation noticed, whispers spread like wildfire, and eyes burned into her back as if questioning why she hadn't left the room, why she hadn't exposed him on the spot. But she did not falter. She would not be the one remembered for breaking first. Her mind raced, a storm behind the calm exterior. Years of building a life, of sacrifices, of late nights and early mornings, of dreaming and planning a future with him, all felt like they had been handed over to someone who had no idea what she had endured. Yet she stood there, silently observing, the warmth of rage mingling with the icy grip of resolve. This was her moment of humiliation, yes, but also the fertile soil where her rebirth would grow. As the choir sang carols, their voices soaring with the joy of the season, she felt a numb detachment. The hymn about love, faith, and forgiveness felt cruelly ironic. Every note was a reminder of what had been betrayed. But the eyes of the congregation were on her, and she realized she had a choice: to crumble under shame or to rise in silence, letting the world underestimate the strength that simmered quietly within. She chose the latter. The rest of the service passed in a blur, and she moved with graceful composure, her movements measured, her expression serene. The mistress trailed behind her husband, laughing softly, unaware of the storm brewing. Every laugh, every whispered word fueled the fire inside her. She had been humiliated publicly, but she would transform that humiliation into a masterstroke. She had learned over the years that power often came quietly behind closed doors, and she had doors yet to open that no one could anticipate. Returning home that evening, the cold didn't touch her the same way. The fire in the fireplace reflected in her eyes, mirroring the resolve that had solidified inside her heart. She thought of all the times she had invested her energy, her resources, and her intellect into building a life for the both of them. She thought of the lavish investments, the properties, the accounts, and the unseen leverage she had silently amassed. This was not the end of her story. It was only the overture. The mistress had no idea who she was dealing with. To the outside world, she might have been a soft-spoken woman, elegant yet unassuming, but beneath the surface lay a mind sharp, calculating, and relentless. Smarty, her inner moniker, was already drafting strategies in her mind, visualizing the exposure, the unraveling of deceit, and the reclamation of what was rightfully hers. Christmas Eve had been stolen from her, yes, but New Year's would be hers to command. Every step she took through the halls of her home echoed in her mind like a drumbeat of preparation. Her husband's betrayal was the spark, but her rise would be the inferno. She reviewed her plans meticulously, her mental ledger accounting for assets, alliances, and opportunities. Every interaction, every piece of information she had gathered over the years, suddenly transformed into ammunition. The mistress had stepped into her world, unaware of the forces she had provoked. As the night deepened, the city outside sparkled with lights that now seemed to mock the pain she had felt hours earlier. But inside, a different kind of light flickered, a flame of determination. She knew she would need to act strategically, to wait for the perfect moment, to let her husband's arrogance become his downfall. There was no room for emotion-driven confrontation, no room for mistakes. She had learned over the years that revenge, when executed with precision, was an art form, and she was a master of it. She moved silently through her private study, reviewing documents, photographs, and digital records that would reveal a truth the world was not ready to see. Her wealth, her accomplishments, her intelligence, all were tools she had cultivated quietly while others underestimated her. And now the stage was set for revelation. She could taste the power in the silence of the night, the thrill of watching deception crumble under the weight of truth. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the city in pristine white. Inside, she smiled faintly, a knowing smile. Christmas had tried to humiliate her, but it had inadvertently prepared her for a rise that no one would see coming. By New Year's morning, she promised herself, everything would change. The mistress would vanish, the betrayal would be exposed, and she would reclaim her throne, not with anger but with undeniable proof of her dominance. And so, as the bells of the city church echoed through the silent streets, marking the end of Christmas Eve, she sat back, letting her mind weave the final threads of a plan that would leave the world in awe. Her tears, held back in the cathedral, were now replaced with clarity and resolve. This was not a story of loss. It was the beginning of a story of rebirth, power, and the undeniable rise of the Black Queen. The night was long, the fire burned low, but the seeds of her power were planted. By the time the city awoke, her plan would already be in motion, and no one, not even the mistress, would see the storm approaching. The first rays of dawn seeped through the curtains, brushing the room in soft gold, but she did not stir immediately. She lay still, eyes open, mind racing. Christmas had ended, leaving her wounded yet awake with clarity. The world still slept, oblivious to the storm that had quietly begun in her home. Today she would begin the work of transforming humiliation into a decisive, unstoppable force. Her breakfast was methodical, almost ritualistic. Each movement deliberate, each sip of coffee a reinforcement of the steel that had settled in her bones. The mansion around her was quiet, the servants and staff unaware of the emotional and strategic battles taking place within their queen's mind. She surveyed her surroundings, her gaze lingering on portraits of her achievements, subtle reminders that her world had been constructed through intellect, ambition, and unwavering resilience. No one had given her power, it had been claimed through silent persistence. She knew that the first step was intelligence gathering. The mistress, in her arrogance, had already revealed weaknesses through her public display of entitlement. The husband, blinded by desire and ego, would continue his patterns unless disrupted by decisive action. She began by reviewing every transaction, every document, and every interaction over the past months. Financial records, property deeds, phone messages, social media footprints, all of it formed a web, and in that web she was already a spider ready to strike. By mid-morning her plan took shape. She would not rush. Patience had always been her greatest weapon. She needed evidence, undeniable proof, and a narrative so potent that no one could refute it. Her mind mapped every scenario, anticipating countermoves, predicting lies, and calculating leverage. The mistress had walked into a world where she had underestimated the very woman she had tried to overshadow. Underestimation was a luxury for the naive, and she was nothing if not vigilant. She made her way to the city office, a secure building where she kept private records and confidential accounts. Each step she took was purposeful, and with every keystroke at her workstation the outline of exposure became clearer. Names, dates, receipts, and secret correspondences. Every piece was a thread in the tapestry of truth she was weaving. The mistress had believed she had gained control through visibility and charm, but she had forgotten that power without depth was fleeting. While others spent the day distracted by holiday fatigue, she moved like a queen in her court, orchestrating the unseen. She contacted trusted allies, discreetly ensuring that support would be in place when the final revelations were revealed. There was no need for confrontation yet. This was preparation, the silent accumulation of assets, allies, and ammunition. Her power, hidden until now, was readying itself to become undeniable. By afternoon, the mansion itself reflected her rising dominance. She walked through the halls with a quiet authority, inspecting rooms, adjusting arrangements, subtly reinforcing her presence in the spaces that had once been tainted by betrayal. Her husband had assumed that her dignity could be shaken with a public spectacle, but he had failed to recognize that humiliation was temporary, strategy was eternal. She moved in spaces both physical and psychological, leaving invisible marks that reminded her of the empire she commanded. The first message arrived in her secure inbox, an anonymous tip about her husband's financial indiscretions that he thought had been carefully hidden. A slow smile curved her lips. The universe, it seemed, was aligning with her intent. She catalogued the information meticulously, cross-referencing it with her existing intelligence. Each piece added weight to a structure that, when revealed, would crumble the facade her husband had maintained for years. Night fell again, but this time the darkness was different. It no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a cloak of strategy, a shield of invisibility under which she plotted her decisive moves. The mistress would come to understand that audacity without preparation was weakness. Every day that passed, every careful observation, every silent maneuver, made her inevitability stronger. She moved through digital files, connecting dots that others had ignored. Her past kindnesses, her investments, her oversight of family finances, everything pointed to the truth she would reveal. The mistress, who had entered this holiday spectacle thinking she had won, had no idea that her triumph was temporary and fragile. The queen did not fight with loud words or petty confrontation. She fought with precision, patience, and revelation. By the time midnight approached, her plans had crystallized. The first phase of her retaliation would not be public. It would be calculated, private, and irreversible. She had compiled documents, recorded evidence, and cross-verified timelines. Every detail had been considered, every possibility accounted for. Tomorrow she would begin to set the pieces in motion, testing reactions, observing weaknesses, and ensuring that no misstep could derail her ultimate victory. Sleep, when it came, was brief and purposeful. She dreamed not of despair but of strategy, of a world bending quietly to her will. The mistress had assumed that visibility and charm were power, but she had failed to account for substance, for intelligence, for patience. By morning the first dominoes would fall, though no one would see it yet. Humiliation had been transformed into strategy, betrayal into an instrument of power. As the first snowflakes of the new day dusted the city once more, she rose again with clarity. Every step she would take was calculated, deliberate. Today would not be marked by tears or exposure in public. Today would be the silent turning of the tide. Her husband's mistakes were now visible, her evidence irrefutable, and her resolve absolute. The queen did not rush. She orchestrated, waited, and struck when victory was inevitable. The day passed in careful execution. Small conversations, brief errands, and subtle inquiries built a network of support and information. The mistress continued unaware of the pressure mounting around her, blind to the inevitability that loomed. Humiliation had become invisibility, and invisibility had become power. Each interaction, each quiet maneuver, tightened the noose of exposure around those who had dared to betray her. By evening she returned to her mansion, a place that had once felt tainted by deception but now resonated with authority. She walked through each room, noting imperfections, adjusting arrangements, creating an atmosphere that mirrored the control she was quietly amassing. She reviewed her evidence once more, ensuring that every piece was correct, unassailable, and ready to deliver the impact she envisioned. The city lights twinkled outside, oblivious to the quiet storm that had risen within the walls of her home. She poured herself a glass of wine, savoring the moment not of celebration but of anticipation. The first seeds of her revenge had been planted, and they were already taking root. Humiliation had been temporary, but power, once nurtured, was enduring. She would rise not with anger but with inevitability, and when she did, the world would have no choice but to acknowledge her dominance. And as the clock struck midnight, marking another day closer to the new year, she closed her eyes, letting a quiet smile form. The mistress, the husband, and anyone else who had doubted her would soon learn that the queen never truly falls. She only waits, plans, and rises when the moment is perfect. The night ended, but the game had just begun. Every move, every calculation, was bringing her closer to the inevitable exposure, and by the dawn of New Year's morning, nothing would be the same. The first light of New Year's Eve dawned cool and crisp, brushing the city with anticipation. She awoke with a sense of purpose, not just of survival or dignity but of momentum. Every second counted now. Humiliation had been endured. The quiet work of strategy had been executed. Today, the first real tremors of exposure would begin to ripple through the life that had sought to mock and diminish her. She moved through her morning routine with deliberate calm. There was no haste, no trace of desperation, only the precise confidence of a queen who had prepared for this exact moment. Her husband, wrapped in arrogance and oblivion, remained unaware that the perfect storm had already been initiated. Every small interaction, Every subtle maneuver from the past days had been positioning her for this inevitable ascent. Her first act of the day was digital and invisible. Carefully curated messages, scheduled disclosures, and financial statements began to find their way to key parties who had influence over her husband's business dealings and social circles. This was not mere revenge. This was the surgical dismantling of a facade built on deceit. She had no need for theatrics. Her evidence, her timing, and her intellect would speak for themselves. By mid-morning, subtle changes began to ripple. Calls were returned differently. Questions were asked that her husband could not answer. Patterns he had carefully constructed to appear flawless were showing cracks. The mistress, in her ignorance and arrogance, remained blissfully unaware, continuing to flaunt her false security in a world she did not yet understand. The queen's patience was a weapon, and it was beginning to cut with precision. She paused briefly to observe herself in the mirror. Her reflection showed elegance, composure, and calm authority. But beneath it lay fire. An intellect honed by years of careful observation, silent work, and measured judgment. This was the power the world never saw at first glance, the power that often went unnoticed until it was too late. And now her moment had arrived. She would not confront with anger, she would expose with inevitability. As the day progressed, she took control of her environment. Phone calls were made, documents delivered discreetly, and strategic allies positioned themselves without fanfare. The first cracks in the husband's carefully constructed life began to appear. Financial discrepancies, social rumors, and subtle inquiries that he could not explain. Each revelation was small but precise, enough to destabilize confidence and invite scrutiny. The mistress finally noticed. Subtle unease began to creep into her demeanor, the golden hair that had once seemed untouchable now framing a face clouded with confusion. She had entered this life believing charm and visibility equaled dominance, but she had failed to recognize the depth of intelligence that had been underestimated. Each small unraveling was orchestrated with the queen's careful precision. By afternoon, whispers had grown into murmurs. The husband, usually confident and imposing, began to fumble. Conversations became hesitant, answers less certain, and cracks in his pride began to show. The queen did not rush, she did not speak. She let the dominoes fall naturally, understanding that exposure was more potent when it was allowed to emerge organically. Humiliation had been public, but the queen's rise would be undeniable and unstoppable. She spent the evening reviewing her work, cross-referencing evidence, and observing reactions. Her control over the situation was meticulous. Every response, every hesitation from her husband and mistress, was noted and catalogued. Each mistake they made in their ignorance added fuel to her strategy. The queen's rise was no longer hypothetical. It was actively unfolding before her eyes. The mansion, which had once felt the weight of betrayal, now echoed with authority. Every room she entered reminded her of her power, her intelligence, and the inevitability of her triumph. She had converted the tools of humiliation into instruments of dominance. What had been public shame was now private leverage, carefully nurtured into unassailable control. Night descended, and with it came the anticipation of culmination. By now, the first waves of exposure were beginning to touch friends, colleagues, and family. The queen's subtle orchestration had set the world in motion, each ripple gathering strength and momentum. Her husband's facade was cracking, the mistress's confidence was faltering, and all that remained was the precise, decisive moment of revelation that would cement her rise. She sat in her private study, reviewing documents and communications one last time. The evidence was undeniable. Every email, every transaction, every trace of betrayal was accounted for, cross-verified, and organized. The queen did not need dramatics, she needed precision. The storm that had begun as a whisper was now becoming a gale, and by New Year's morning, the world would witness the full force of her intellect and authority. Outside, the city shimmered with holiday lights, oblivious to the quiet revolution taking place within the walls of one carefully orchestrated life. Snow fell silently, covering streets in pristine white, and for a moment the world seemed at peace. Yet inside, the queen's mind was a whirlwind of clarity, anticipation, and determination. Humiliation had forged her, strategy had sharpened her, and now her rise was inevitable. As midnight approached, she felt the culmination of her efforts. Every thread, every connection, Every calculated move had been placed for maximum impact. Her husband would be exposed not as the man she had loved, but as the liar he truly was. The mistress would be revealed not as a conqueror, but as a naive interloper in a world she could not comprehend. The queen would rise, not with fury but with undeniable truth. She allowed herself a small smile as the clock ticked closer to New Year's. The first phase of her plan had succeeded. The seeds of exposure had taken root, and the world's perception of her life, her husband, and the mistress was beginning to shift. She would not rest. There was more to be done. But for now, the first tremors of her rise had been felt. And so, as the city slept under the cover of snow and holiday lights, she sat poised, ready to move the final pieces into place. The queen did not celebrate prematurely, but she acknowledged the inevitability of victory. The mistress, the husband, and anyone else who had underestimated her would soon realize that the Black Queen did not merely endure betrayal. She transformed it into her ascension. The night ended, but the revelation had only just begun. By the first light of New Year's morning, everything would change, and the world would witness the Queen's strategic brilliance in full. The first light of New Year's morning painted the city in a crisp, golden glow, but inside the mansion she felt a heat far stronger than the sun. Today the Queen's patience would pay off. Today all the careful planning, every silent maneuver, every calculated moment of observation would come to fruition. Her humiliation, endured months ago, had been transformed into power, and the world was about to witness it. She rose with precision, each movement deliberate, radiating calm authority. The house was alive with her intent. Emails sent, messages delivered, evidence curated and cross-checked. Allies had been informed, timelines coordinated, and her husband's empire of pride and pretense was ready to crumble under the weight of undeniable truth. She had worked in silence, but now the final act would unfold like the crescendo of a symphony. Her first act of the morning was subtle yet devastating. Key figures in her husband's professional and social circles began receiving the compiled evidence. Financial indiscretions, secret correspondences, and proof of lies carefully disguised over time. These were not dramatic accusations. They were facts, irrefutable and precise. The world he had manipulated for years now began to see through the veil he had relied upon so heavily. At the same time, she orchestrated quiet exposure of the mistress. Photos, messages, and subtle hints of her duplicity spread quietly but effectively through social channels, socialites, and even family members. The mistress, who had once walked boldly into the cathedral on Christmas Eve, now found herself isolated and scrutinized. Her charm, once considered her armor, was unraveling under the light of truth. By mid-morning the effects were undeniable. Her husband, once untouchable in his arrogance, was now stumbling through interactions he could no longer control. Friends asked questions he could not answer, business partners expressed concern, and whispers began to echo in rooms he had long assumed were safe. The Queen's strategic timing had ensured that these revelations would land simultaneously, amplifying impact and maximizing exposure. She moved through her mansion with grace, observing the subtle shifts in reality she had created. The air felt electric, charged with the quiet thrill of inevitable triumph. She did not need to confront, she merely observed. Her power had become a force of nature, unfolding with an almost poetic inevitability. Humiliation, once her curse, had become the instrument of her authority. Every document, every image, every verified fact contributed to a crescendo that no one could stop. The mistress began to falter publicly. Smiles that once seemed assured now wavered. Confidence that had once been unshakable began to crack. People she had relied on for validation started to question her presence and intentions. Every subtle act of deception she had relied upon was revealed in microbursts of exposure, carefully curated by the Queen to avoid premature confrontation yet powerful enough to destabilize. Her husband's face, once composed and confident, betrayed anxiety, confusion, and desperation. He attempted explanations, casual denials, and misdirections, but every attempt was undermined by the undeniable evidence quietly circulating. Pride, arrogance, and ego, the very tools that had emboldened him, became chains that restrained him from salvaging his reputation. The Queen had ensured that he would not escape accountability, and now the inevitability of his exposure could be seen in every glance, every hesitant conversation. She did not gloat. The queen understood that triumph was most potent when silent, dignified, and unassailable. Her satisfaction was private, contained in the knowledge that the world would soon witness the full impact of her strategy. Every move, every calculated step had been executed with precision. The mistress, isolated and scrutinized, and her husband, exposed and faltering, were trapped in the narrative she had designed. By evening, the city itself seemed to echo the shift. Conversations had changed, social circles whispered differently, and reputations were being recalibrated. The queen's influence was no longer invisible. It had begun to manifest in the perceptions and decisions of everyone around her. The evidence she had carefully curated ensured that no argument, no denial could reverse the course. Humiliation had become leverage, betrayal had become opportunity, and the queen's ascension was inevitable. She moved through her home, a quiet observer of the ripple effect she had unleashed. Photographs, messages, financial evidence, and carefully timed disclosures had created a reality in which her husband and the mistress could no longer control perception. The queen's patience, intelligence, and discipline had transformed the narrative from victimhood into undeniable authority. As the clock neared midnight, marking the approach of the new year, the final elements of her plan were set in motion. Public awareness, professional scrutiny, and private confrontation were all synchronized to deliver maximum impact. By the first light of January 1st, the world would see what had been invisible, the full weight of betrayal transformed into triumph. She stood by the window looking out at the sparkling city below. Snowflakes drifted silently, almost in reverence to the queen's silent, unstoppable rise. She allowed herself a small, private smile. The humiliation endured in the cathedral had been nothing compared to this. The queen's strategy, executed in silence, had revealed what others had never anticipated: that power does not require visibility but inevitability. And as the first stroke of midnight rang through the city, the revelations she had orchestrated began to fully resonate. Social whispers became undeniable recognition, private doubts became public awareness, and the mistress and husband alike were forced to confront the consequences of underestimating her. The queen had not rushed, she had waited. She had not confronted, she had calculated. And now, the world bowed to the inevitability of her ascent. Humiliation had birthed strategy. Betrayal had birthed intelligence. Pain had birthed resilience. And as the final pieces of the plan fell into place, she realized something profound. She had not merely exposed deceit. She had transformed it into her rebirth. The queen had risen. The first New Year's morning marked more than a calendar shift. It marked the rise of a queen who had endured betrayal, orchestrated exposure, and reclaimed her power. What remained now was to secure her future and embrace the freedom and authority she had fought so meticulously to achieve. The first light of New Year's morning bathed the city in a soft, golden glow, but inside her mansion, there was a heat far more intense. One born of triumph, power, and absolute clarity. She moved through her home with grace, every step a statement of authority. The queen had risen. The humiliation of Christmas Eve, the rage of betrayal, the long nights of planning and precision, all had culminated in this moment of undeniable power. Her husband's world was unraveling before her eyes. Calls went unanswered, social contacts questioned him relentlessly, and the mistress, stripped of the facade of charm and confidence, had begun to vanish from the circles she had assumed she had conquered. What had seemed like a distant victory in the shadows of strategy had now become vivid and public. The queen's rise was no longer silent. It was visible, felt, and impossible to ignore. She observed quietly as the first confirmations of her influence reached her. Emails, social media posts, and private messages confirmed the irreversible exposure she had orchestrated. Her husband, once a figure of pride and control, now appeared fragile, cornered by the very evidence he had assumed would remain hidden. The mistress, whose arrogance had led her to flaunt her presence at the cathedral, now faced the subtle, relentless consequences of underestimating her. But she did not act in anger. Triumph was most potent when dignified, and she had mastered that art. She allowed the world to witness the fallout, knowing that each ripple reinforced her authority and reputation. She had not merely exposed deceit, she had transformed it into her ascension, her rebirth. Humiliation had become leverage, betrayal had become strategy, and every calculated move had brought her to this point of victory. By mid-morning she began to secure her future. She reviewed her assets, her investments, and her plans, ensuring that every detail of her life was fortified. The mistakes of others had created opportunities, and she was adept at seizing them. Her mansion, her wealth, and her social position were no longer just symbols of success. They were instruments of undeniable power. The queen's authority was not granted by anyone. It had been claimed through intelligence, patience, and relentless determination. She walked through the rooms of her home, observing the spaces she had created and curated over the years. Each room reflected her resilience and vision, a silent testament to the life she had built despite betrayal. The humiliation endured in public spaces had been transformed into private triumph, each corner of her home echoing the quiet power she had cultivated. Every detail of her life was now a reflection of mastery, and the world would soon understand that she had risen not in spite of betrayal, but because of it. Her mind turned to the mistress, who had once dared to intrude upon her life and joy. The queen did not need to confront her directly. The careful orchestration of exposure had ensured that others would recognize the truth without drama. The mistress's confidence crumbled in private and public spaces alike, revealing the fragility of her position. This was not just victory, it was the elegance of strategy realized, the inevitability of justice delivered without spectacle. As afternoon approached, the full impact of her rise became evident. Friends, family, colleagues, and social circles began to realign. Alliances shifted, respect was restored, and whispers of admiration for her intelligence, patience, and strategic brilliance spread quietly but powerfully. She had not fought with anger or brute force. She had fought with mind, patience, and precision. The queen's ascent was complete, and it was unmistakable. She took a moment to reflect on the journey. The tears she had held back in the cathedral, the nights spent in planning, the silence she had maintained while others underestimated her. Every step had led to this rebirth. She realized that true power was not in retaliation but in transformation. She had converted betrayal into opportunity, humiliation into strategy, and pain into authority. The queen had risen not as a reaction to wrong, but as a declaration of unstoppable presence. By evening she stood in her study, looking out over the city she had quietly conquered. Snow fell silently, pristine and undisturbed, mirroring the clarity of her mind. She raised a glass to herself, a private celebration of endurance, intelligence, and triumph. The past no longer held her captive. Her husband's deception had been dismantled, the mistress had been neutralized, and she had secured a future defined by her own rules, her own power. The world had witnessed the rise of the Black Queen, not with fanfare, not with shouting, but with inevitability. She had endured betrayal, orchestrated exposure, and claimed victory with grace and precision. The queen's story was no longer one of humiliation or loss. It was a narrative of strategy, resilience, and rebirth. She had turned betrayal into transformation and left a legacy of intelligence and authority that no one could challenge. As midnight approached once again, marking the end of the first day of the new year, she allowed herself a deep, victorious breath. The past had tested her, the present had proven her, and the future was hers to command. The queen had not merely survived, she had thrived, risen, and reclaimed her throne with undeniable brilliance. And so, as the city celebrated the new year with fireworks, music, and joy, she stood quietly, observing the world she had mastered. The humiliation endured, the betrayal faced, and the nights spent in patient strategy had all led to this ultimate truth. She was unstoppable, undeniable, and unshakable. The queen had risen, and nothing or no one could diminish her power. Humiliation was no longer her story. Betrayal was no longer her curse. She was the queen reborn, rising from the ashes of deception into the throne of her own making. And in that quiet, powerful moment she realized, the Black Queen does not merely survive the storm, she commands it.